Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. Today we're going to talk about vegetables that you can still plant from seed in the garden in August. Now the list is starting to shrink as we get closer to fall and closer to our first frost date, but there are still plenty of seeds that we can plant in the August garden. When I'm looking for seeds that I can plant in the August garden, they're going to fall into one of two categories. I'm either looking for plants that will mature in 60 days or less. Now that exact number might vary depending on exactly where in the world you're growing. I'm growing in Connecticut. We're in zone 6 and our average first frost date is about October 15th. So I'm estimating 60 days to maturity should give me enough time to be able to grow a plant up to maturity and to be able to harvest it before frost. The other type of plant that I would be looking for, the other category, would be plants that are not going to be killed by a frost. These are plants that don't have to mature in that really quickly shortening window between now and when my first frost is going to come and kill the summer garden. So that may not sound like a lot of plants, but there are actually quite a few plants that fall into those categories. We're going to go through some of them together today. So when figuring out what's going to work for you to grow in your August garden from seed, the first thing you're going to want to do is figure out when your first frost date is. As I mentioned, mine varies year to year, but it's usually somewhere in mid-October, so I use October 15th as a reference point. Yours may be earlier or yours may be later. If yours is later, then you're going to be able to grow more plants than what I am going to list and share here today. One thing to keep in mind when calculating how many days till your first frost is that a lot of these plants, when you look at the seed packet, it'll tell you how many days to maturity. One thing to keep in mind is that that is assuming ideal growing conditions. That's basically assuming perfect summer weather growing conditions with lots of sunlight, with the ideal amount of rain. So even though I do actually, at this very beginning of August, have more than 60 days till my first frost date, I'm sticking with plants that are 60 days and under for a couple of reasons. First of all, because I know at the end of the season, as daylight hours get shorter, it's going to take a little bit longer than that estimated days to maturity that my seed packet gives me. Another reason is that when it comes to certain plants, for example, fruiting plants, for example, like cucumbers, zucchinis, plants like that, that days to maturity is when you harvest your very first fruit. Now, if I grew a cucumber plant and I was able to harvest one cucumber before frost and then the frost came and killed my plant, I wouldn't really be satisfied with that harvest. You know, I want to have an extended harvest. So I'm also looking for plants that are either going to mature early enough before my first frost date that I can get multiple harvests from them, or else plants that are just a one and done type of harvest, something like a carrot where you're only going to get one harvest from that plant. So let's talk about the specific plants that I'm growing in my August garden starting from seed, and then you can adjust this to be tailored to your garden based on your specific climate and your specific frost date. One thing I do want to mention right off the bat that I will not be planting in my August garden, but many of you may be able to, is cucumbers. Now, for example, if I look here at this silver slicer cucumber seed packet, it's going to tell me 64 days to maturity. That is slightly outside the 60-day window that I'm looking for. If you have a first frost date that's a little bit later than mine, if yours tends to be later October, even into November, cucumbers could be a great option for you. Here in my garden, I know it'll be a little bit risky. I might not get a harvest, and if I do, it probably won't be a satisfying harvest from cucumbers. So while that may be an option for many of you, I won't be growing those in my garden. What I am going to be starting from seed in August is summer squash, including zucchinis. So for example, I have this Cocazelle zucchini here. This is 58 days to maturity. I have also this long white of Palermo zucchini, which gives me a maturity range of 45 to 55 days. Now, those are both early enough, plus zucchinis mature so fast once they set fruit. Those are both early enough that I would be able to harvest most likely a handful of zucchini. Well, you know, more than a handful, because sometimes a single zucchini is a handful. But I would be able to harvest several zucchini from each plant, most likely, assuming that everything goes well. So to me, that's worth it to grow. So summer squash is something that I will be planting in my garden in August. Another really quick maturing variety that I like to grow in my garden is bush beans. So for example, I have these Maxabelle bush beans here, 50 days to maturity. I have these Jade bush beans here, 55 days to maturity. Royal Burgundy bush beans, this is right up at the edge, 60 days to maturity. Given that I've built in that cushion, I should be able to get a respectable harvest from these bush beans, so that is something that I would plant from seed in August in my garden. Now, something else that would be killed by frost that I'd be kind of fudging the numbers a little bit is basil. Now, basil's a little bit different because it's not a fruiting plant. You harvest it for the leaves. Honestly, you can harvest basil whenever you feel like the plant is big enough. I will not be planting basil from seed in the ground. I will be starting some basil from seed in pots on my deck because I know if I get a random early frost, I can go ahead and bring those pots inside and then bring them back out. So basil I'll be starting, but only that way. I won't be starting any basil seeds directly in the garden. So that is the list that I have of plants that I expect to mature before my first fall frost. Thankfully, that's not everything that we can grow in October because I have lots of other plants here that we can grow from seed that can withstand a light frost and will definitely extend our harvest season. The first one I'm going to mention, and this actually, if I planted it now, would mature before my first fall frost, but I put it in the second category because it can also withstand a frost, and that is radishes. Radishes are incredibly quick maturing given ideal growing conditions. So for example, the French breakfast radish I have here, 26 days to maturity. In my experience, it usually takes a little bit longer than that, but you know, even if it takes a week or so longer than that, that's still a really fast turnaround time. We also have the lady slipper radish here, 25 days to maturity, so you know, even a little bit faster. So radishes, you could get several successions of radishes in before frost, but even if you don't, radishes will not be killed by frost. These are a great crop to grow in the fall garden because of that quick maturity time and because they actually prefer to grow in cool weather. I don't grow radishes at all in the heat of summer. I find that they have better flavor grown in the fall garden, so that's when I'll be planting radishes. Honestly, I may not even start radishes until September, but they're something that you can definitely grow in August. Next, I want to mention carrots. Most people, I think in my area, tend to start carrots. You can start them earlier in spring or you can start them in July. So starting them in August would be a bit of a stretch, but you could definitely start carrots in August. These are something that will not be killed by frost. In fact, carrots can actually overwinter in the ground surprisingly well, as long as you'd keep the ground from freezing solid for the purpose of being able to harvest the carrots. You know, if your ground is frozen solid, you won't really be able to pull the carrot from the ground very easily at all. But if you mulch these really thickly, then you should be able to harvest these, at least in my area. I shouldn't say a blanket statement because I'm not sure. It depends a lot on your winter weather. But here in Connecticut, we have pretty serious winters, and we could still harvest carrots all winter long in the garden, as long as we keep the ground soft enough to harvest. So growing carrots can be a great option. For example, this carrot here, this is the Danvers 126, tells me 60 to 80 days to maturity. So that's something I could potentially harvest before my first frost, but if it stays in the ground, it gets frosted on, that's not going to kill it. So that's a great option to keep growing all through the fall. Now I have several other varieties here. We have, of course, our trusty Brassicas, which are one of the go-to plant categories when it comes to the fall garden. So I have cabbage, I have broccoli, cauliflower, I have kale. These are all great options to plant now because these can all withstand a frost. Especially something like a kale or a cabbage where you're really just harvesting the leaves. Those can be a great option to start now. You know, I prefer to start these in pots and transplant them out into the garden, but many people do have success direct sowing them. This could be another great option for your fall garden as well. I actually have several of these that I just started in little pots on my deck, and I plan to transplant these out into the garden in a few weeks. One other brassica that I should mention, and this is the only one that I will generally direct sow in the garden, is kohlrabi. Now kohlrabi here, this one says 55 to 60 days to maturity. This other one doesn't have a maturity date, but it's the purple version of the same variety, so it should be about the same. Now, these grow really quickly, and similarly to the other brassicas that I mentioned, these are not going to be killed by frost, so you can keep those going in your garden pretty well into the fall. Next, I want to mention peas. Peas are a great fall crop. Peas prefer to grow in cool weather as opposed to the heat of summer. You know, I have peas off the camera here and that I planted this spring. They're all dried up and they really don't look happy because they did not like the heat of summer. But now it's time to plant peas again for a fall crop. I did actually plant my first succession planting of fall peas a couple weeks ago, and I'll be planting another crop of fall peas within the next couple days. So these here, for example, I have sugar snap peas here. This says 68 days to maturity. And again, this is a plant that's not going to be bothered by a light frost. So even though that's outside of my 60-day window, these will keep going even through some light frosts. They'll actually prefer the cooler weather. So these are a great plant to plant from seed in your garden in August. Next, we need to talk about the greens category. You know, there's lots of plants that fall into this category. You know, of course, there's the classic lettuce, the most common lettuce. And lettuces can mature incredibly quickly. But the real reason that I like to plant lettuce for the fall garden, starting in August and into September, actually starting in July and into September really, is because lettuce grows so well in the cool weather. Every year, lettuce is my first harvest in the spring garden because it grows really well in the cool weather before all these plants like these tomatoes and peppers, before it's warm enough for them to handle. So the same is true at the end of the season. When it starts to cool off and these tomatoes and peppers are going to suffer, that's when lettuce really shines. Lettuce loves the cool weather. At this time of year, because I am planting lettuce for the fall garden to hopefully have an extended harvest as long as it will go, I'm going to choose varieties that are cool tolerant. So for example, I have this tango leaf lettuce here, and this one is cold hardy and can overwinter without any protection. Now, I'm not sure if it will overwinter without any protection in my zone, but in the zone where this was grown, apparently it does do that. So, but I'm not necessarily looking for it to overwinter. I'm just looking for it to go as long as possible. Pretty much every year I'm harvesting lettuce into December in my garden, and you know, when that's one of the only things in the garden, it is extra valuable. So I'll be looking for lettuce varieties like that. Here's another one, winter density. When you see something with winter in the title, that's a sign that that is a cool tolerant lettuce. So I'll be planting lots of plants of lettuce. I'll be starting them right away and continually succession sowing over the next few weeks to hopefully get a nice extended fall harvest of lettuce. Now similarly, there are other greens that you can plant this time of year that will make a great fall harvest. Tatsoi is a great Asian green. This green here, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce, but I'll let you see the name there. This is one of my favorite greens for fall harvest. I find it's really delicious. It's kind of similar to spinach, but it's a little bit, I don't really know how to describe it. I like it better than spinach. And I find that in my area, it generally performs better than spinach. So look through Asian greens. There are lots of interesting greens out there, some of which you may not even be familiar with. I know there's plenty that I am still not familiar with, and plenty others that I have grown and loved, but wasn't familiar with when I first started gardening. So a lot of these greens tend to be very cold tolerant and will go far into the season for you. Now similarly, I have some other greens here, things like arugula and spinach. These are great plants to plant this time of year because arugula, I love arugula, but I do find when I plant arugula in the spring, I usually get a really delicious harvest from it. It's ready really quickly, but what I find is that that harvest season doesn't last very long. It doesn't take long at all before it gets too hot and the arugula starts to bolt and turn its attention to seed production. The nice thing about planting for a fall harvest is that as it's maturing, the weather's cooling down, the daylight hours are shorter. That's going to tell arugula, no, it's not time to produce seeds. It's just going to keep producing leaves for you, which is, you know, that makes it a great option for the fall garden. Also, something like spinach, I find does really well in the fall garden. What I find is that the best harvests of spinach that I've ever had have been when I started plants for the fall garden and they overwintered. And then the spinach in the spring that I harvested was ready so early before anything else. You get lots of time to harvest it before it will bolt, and that makes a delicious early spring harvest. So if you plan ahead, that's another type of plant that you could be thinking of planting now. So I hope this is helpful. I hope this encourages you that there are still lots of plants that you can grow in August from seed. So let me know what you're planting in August, and also let me know where in the world you're growing and when your first frost day is, because I would love to hear how gardeners in other parts of the country handle planting in August. I hope you're all having a great day. I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.